Hi, it's Shona at The Art of Yearning, and I am here today to add a new feature called Saturday Storytime. This week I'm going to start with a lovely book that is a favorite of mine by Parker Palmer called Let Your Life Speak. He is also the author of The Courage to Teach, and he is a Quaker, and that is actually important. And his writing is about, in this particular book, it's about calling and vocation and finding your way to work that is really fulfilling and meaningful to you. This is one of my very favorite books. It's only 115 pages long. I have carried it at one point in my life. I carried it in my purse for 6 months. I also I think it's one of those books that you can read, but then dip into for contemplation. So I highly recommend this book if you're having trouble with the questions of calling and calling and vocation. I'm going to read to you a section of it from a subsection called The Ecology of a Life. And I think rather than introducing the ideas, I'll just let it speak for itself. Despite the American myth, I cannot be or do whatever I desire. A truism, to be sure, but a truism we often deny. Our created natures make us like organisms in an ecosystem. There are some roles and relationships in which we thrive, and others in which we wither and die. It is clear, for example, as I enter my 60s, that I cannot and will not be President of the United States, even though I grew up surrounded by a rhetoric that said that anyone, read any white male, could rise to that lofty role. I no longer grieve this particular limitation, for I cannot imagine a crueler fate for someone with my nature than to be president of anything, let alone a nation-state. Still, encouraged by the myth of the limitless self, I spent many years trying to deny this ecological truth. Here is a story to prove it. During my tenure at Pendle Hill, I was offered the opportunity to become the president of a small educational institution. I had visited the campus, spoken with trustees, administrators, faculty, and students, and had been told that if I wanted it, the job was most likely mine. Vexed as I was about vocation, I was quite certain that this was the job for me. So, as is the custom in the Quaker community, I called on half a dozen trusted friends to help me discern my vocation by means of a clearness committee, a process in which the group refrains from giving you advice, but spends 3 hours asking you honest, open questions to help you discover your own inner truth. Looking back, of course, it is clear to me that my real intent in convening this group was not to discern anything, but to brag about being offered a job I had already decided to accept. For a while, the questions were easy, at least for a dreamer like me. What is your vision for this institution? What is its mission in the larger society? How would you change the curriculum? How would you handle decision-making? What about dealing with conflict? Halfway into the process, someone asked a question that sounded easier yet, but turned out to be very hard. What would you like most about being a president? The simplicity of that question loosed me from my head and lowered me into my heart. I remember pondering for at least a full minute before I could respond. Then, very softly and tentatively, I started to speak. Well, I would not like having to give up my teaching and my writing. I would not like the politics of the presidency, never knowing who your real friends are. I would not like having to glad hand people I do not respect simply because they have money. I would not like... Gently but firmly, the person who had posed the question interrupted me. May I remind you that I asked what you would most like? I responded impatiently. Yes, I'm working my way toward an answer. Then I resumed my sullen but honest litany. I would not like having to give up my summer vacations. I would not like having to wear a suit and tie all the time. I would not like... Once again, the questioner called me back to the original question, but this time I felt compelled to give the only honest answer I possessed, an answer that came from the very bottom of my barrel, an answer that appalled even me as I spoke it. Well, said I, in the smallest voice I possess, I guess what I'd like most is getting my picture in the paper with the word president under it. I was sitting with seasoned Quakers who knew that, though my answer was laughable, my mortal soul was clearly at stake. They did not laugh at all, but went into a long and serious silence, in a silence in which I could only sweat and inwardly groan. Finally, my questioner broke the silence with a question that cracked all of us up and cracked me open. Parker, he said, can you think of an easier way to get your picture in the paper? By then it was obvious, even to me, that my desire to be president had much more to do with my ego than with the ecology of my life. So obvious that when the Clearness Committee ended, I called the school and withdrew my name from consideration. Had I taken that job, it would have been very bad for me and a disaster for the school. I have read that story probably a dozen times, and this is the first time I managed to read it without laughing in the middle of it. I'm very proud of myself because I practiced. But that sense of going so far down a path that is clearly ego driven and trying to prove something about oneself is, to me, it's a familiar sense. I've gone down that path. And for me, this book was really key. I started reading it. I read it for the first time a dozen years ago or so. It was in the library at the Center for Supportive Teaching that I was working at. And I carried it. There were 2 copies, and I took one of the library copies out and I carried it in my purse. And I read it on my commute. And then I read it again, and then I read it again. And I come from a really academic background, so this idea of vocation and calling, I don't know if it was completely new to me at the time, but the ways in which he talks about it were really new to me. And he's unabashedly talking about calls from a higher being, or a higher organizing principle. I think I talk about it that way in some blog post. And so I highly recommend this book if you're struggling with the idea of vocation, if you are sure that you have a place in the world and a role to play, but you're having a lot of trouble figuring out what it is, or you're trying to do it with the mind instead of the intuition and the body and the whole self. This is a really lovely, short, but substantial piece of writing. And there's 5 short essays in it, and each of them is sort of, well, the whole book's 115 pages, so it's sort of 20 to 30 pages per 5 sections. And if you pick up this book and find something really meaningful in it, please let me know in the comments down below. And I would love to discuss this book or the idea of vocation with you at any point. Tune in next week for another Saturday story time at the Art of Yearning. I'll talk to you later.